evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to this evening's webinar. My name is Wei-Ling, and I'm the president of Badan Warisan Malaysia. We are honored to be collaborating with the International National Trust Organization, INTO, to bring this talk to you on the preservation of our national heritage, a case study on Gunung Kanthan. Tonight, we are excited and honored to be bringing together three distinguished speakers who are each respected authorities in their respected fields of expertise. Collectively, they will highlight important aspects of conservation and preservation of heritage, as well as that of our natural environment. They will also share why it is imperative and critical that Gunung Kanthan and other distinctive limestone hills and karst formations in the Kinta Valley in the state of Perak be preserved for future generations to come. These limestone hills have taken eons of years to form, and once they disappear, they can never be reclaimed. As a body, Badan Warisan Malaysia's focus is on the preservation and conservation of both tangible and intangible heritage. And in the case of Gunung Kanthan, the built heritage that lies in the vicinity of these caves, we feel it is important to dedicate a webinar to Gunung Kanthan as an entity to try to understand what exactly is at stake. Tonight's discussion also looks to explore solutions which suggest alternative ways to address ways to preserve Gunung Kanthan. Our speakers will also share their points of view and experiences in grassroots advocacy and their success in campaigns that championed and resulted in the preservation and conservation of important historical and environmental sites. We are indeed honored to be part of the extended INTO global family, who are supportive of one another to achieve a common goal in the preservation of our built heritage, culture, and the natural environment. Through a shared passion, we hope our campaigns are far-reaching and have the ability to cross borders and create a resonance that stretches throughout both the local and international communities. Tonight's speakers will also discuss why it is vital to protect cultural heritage, cultural landscapes, not only for their beauty and intrinsic value, but also as sacred spaces for our well-being and for the economic value of a good quality environment. Before I would begin, I would like to highlight that at the end of the session this evening, our speakers would be happy to answer questions. So if you have any questions, please submit them into the Q&A box as we go along. If you wish to share a point of view, please share them in the chat box, and we will try our best to answer them at the end of the session. Our first speaker, Dr. Ruth Kiew, is a respected botanist and recognized as one of the few experts on limestone hills in Malaysia. Speaking tonight as a representative from the Malaysian Cave and Karst Conservancy, she will share with us why it is important that Gunung Kanthan be protected and saved for future generations to come. Her talk covers important data gleaned from extensive field research that has been conducted in and around these hills over the years. Dr. Kiew has been researching karst and limestone formations in Malaysia for more than 37 years. Her interest in limestone hills first started when she visited Taman Negara in 1984. And since then, she has visited, studied, and conducted important fieldwork and research on almost all the limestone hills in both Peninsula and East Malaysia. Born in the UK, our speaker attained a degree from Cambridge University, specializing in tropical botany. In 1969, she traveled to Malaysia to continue her PhD fieldwork research in palms. It was during this period that she met her Malaysian husband, Dr. Kiew, who was at the time conducting research in frogs at the University of Malaya. Dr. Kiew has lived and worked in Malaysia since 1972, and her first appointment in 1972 was as a lecturer and researcher at the UPM, which is the University of Pertanian, Malaysia, where her research concentrated on taxonomy and herbaceous groups related to the African violet. She worked as a professor of botany at UPM until 1997, a good 25 years. Thereafter, she was attached to the Singapore Botanical Gardens as the keeper of the herbarium and library until 2006. She is currently part of the research team at FRIM, which focuses on the study of the biodiversity of limestone hills. Tonight, it is indeed a privilege to have Dr. Kiew here with us to shed light on the significance of Gunung Kanthan and why there is a pressing urgency for this unique limestone mountain to be preserved. Please welcome Dr. Ruth Kiew.
Thank you very much for joining us. For us, it's this evening, but I think with our guests from UK, it must be quite early in the morning. Yes, the reason that I think it's important to give this talk is that when the issue of Gunung Kanthan comes up, I'm often asked, why is Gunung Kanthan so special? Why are you making such a noise about it? So what I hope to do today is to explain to people why Gunung Kanthan really is somewhere special. And here is Gunung Kanthan. As you can see, it's a karst hill, which is very unlike anything else in our tropical rainforest here, because you can see it's very heavily eroded limestone, very ancient, very rugged, with a lot of different cracks and valleys and crevices. And in our tropical climate, it's the only place where we find caves. So it's a very special geological formation, and it's become a very special place for plants and animals. And you can see in the background, this is Gunung Kanthan itself, that the quarry is already active. Next, please. From the map, you can see that it lies in Perak. It's number 7 at the top. And in the Ipoh Valley, which we call the Kinta Valley, there are a whole range of really very large, what we call karst limestone, these towers with the sheer limestone cliffs. And traditionally, because this is on the west coast and has a very good infrastructure, it has been a mine for more than 100 years here and there. The estimate on the number of karst depends on your definition of a karst. If you say they should be big, we have about 93. But if you count all the little small ones, then it becomes more than 100. But what is remarkable is the area of land that they occupy, which is minute, 0.15, as you can see here. And when we compare that with the biodiversity of plants and animals, you'll see that the limestone hills have a disproportionate amount of biodiversity. And because limestone is very important as a source of cement, about 1/3 of these hills are quarried already. Next, please. Next. So this is a close-up of the Gunung Kanthan. If we can just go back. And you can see it's been divided into different zones. This is by the quarry company. Area A is the traditional quarry that was mining for many years. And then you see to the north, there's a buffer zone. And outside the buffer zone is a housing estate. And this has been quite a problem because of flying rocks and dust from area A. So now the quarrying is moving to area C, which you can see there is a long low hill. And area D is where the very large cave is. We call it the Cathedral Cave. Next, please. So this is a view of zone A, and you can see how that it's quarried from the top to the bottom by cutting off layer by layer. And it's quite difficult here to get an idea of scale. This is really very massive. Next, please. Next, please. So most people, when they think of limestone hills, tend to think of them as being a place where you get quarries and that's where your cement comes from. But actually there are many different multiple values of karst hills. And this is what I want to illustrate today. The various aspects, they're very important for landscape. They look very like those Chinese paintings with the rocky, craggy, tower-like hills. They're extremely important for geology because this is, as I said, the only place where you get caves, and there are a lot of very interesting cave features inside, like stalagmites and stalactites and many other things. Plant and animal diversity, very peculiar flora and fauna because it's such a difficult place to live. Many endemic with species that are only known from one hill, and many of them endangered, as we know, from mining. In our area where our soil tends to be quite acid, the only place that we find fossils preserved is in limestone hills. So they're very important for archaeology, that will provide us with information on the past, both of human remains and animals too. Recently, they've become much more well known for eco activities and climbing, rock climbing up the sheer faces and caving are becoming increasingly important as people become knowledgeable about limestone hills. And from when the first settlements in Malaysia, caves have always had a fascination for religion because people will tell you the atmosphere is very sacred and quiet and very peaceful. So you will see when we talk a bit later that in fact in Kanthan we have both Hindu, Buddhist and Taoist temples. Recently, the area has even become valued as a resort, and this is obviously something that is going to expand in the future. And in Sabah and Sarawak, since prehistoric times, the birds' nests have been collected, and today they're a multi-million-dollar source of revenue for the local people. The next slide, please. So if we start off by looking at landscape, this is the zone C. And this is really what personifies Gunung Kanthan, this sheer white cliff. And this is the worry that if this is mined, then the whole character of Kanthan will be lost, because this is the major architectural feature that you can call it. So it's very important for landscape. Next, please. Zone D is where there's this very large cave. You enter at one side of the hill, go through 435 meters, and you'll come out on the other side. It really is a massive and awe-inspiring cave, and you can see the very large stalactites there and stalagmites that cascade down in the cave. And there's a stream running through, and just 2 or 3 weeks ago in the national paper, they reported that cave drawings have been found. So this is very exciting indeed. There's also a cave in Zone C. This has not been explored in details, but there are reports that fossils are there. So next slide, please. The next slide. The fossils in this cave are very interesting because there are remains of orangutan, and as all Malaysians know, we no longer get live orangutan in Malaysia, except in the zoo. You have to go either to Borneo or Sumatra to see them. But the fossil experts have shown us quite conclusively that in the past, orangutan lived in our forests, and together with the remains of fossils of the orangutan, there are fossils of bats, monkeys, pigs, and porcupines. And tentatively, because I'm not sure if this work has been published, it's ongoing, the most recent are 10,000, but as you can see, they're thought to stretch back 750,000 years ago. And the picture on the photograph on the right is of sea lilies, and this is actually in the limestone itself. So this is part of the marine sediment that the hills were actually made of before they were raised up. And this is a photograph taken by the Malaysian Nature Society when they did their survey there. Next slide, please. It's the iconic animal because obviously you've seen how rugged and difficult it is to live on limestone. But we call this our mountain goat, Kambing Gurun, or Surau in English. And this is a sort of goat, Capricornus. It's protected in Malaysia, and it's quite characteristic of rocky places, especially limestone hills. And I was very happy when I went to Gunung Kanthan quite recently that there's still a population there, but it has not been studied in detail. So we don't know whether it's a family and they're breeding, but they're still there. So this is our iconic animal protected in Peninsular Malaysia. Next slide, please. Next, please. But most of the very interesting animals are actually very small. We might even call them creepy crawlies. And one of these is a trapdoor spider, globally a critically endangered species. Fascinating because we call it a living fossil, because we have very ancient fossils that appear to be identical to the ones that are alive today. So it looks as though they've never died out. They've survived as a group for millennia or even eons. And you can see it lives in a hole, it has a trap, and those are the trip wires. So when a creature comes across and trips on the wire, the little spider will sense it and come out and grab it and eat it. And we thank Liz Price for this very nice photo. Very recently, in 2014, a bent-toed gecko was discovered. And this is another group that seems to be a limestone specialist and shows that there's still actually more things to learn. Next one. But the biggest diversity of any animals are snails. And of course, in Malaysia, I've told you the soil is acid, which is not a good habitat for snails because they need calcium for their shells. But on limestone, they really are incredibly diverse. I should point out actually that these snails are only a few millimeters in size. They're not like garden snails. And our snail specialists are Lim and Clemens have counted at least 63 species. 7 of these are only known from Gunung Kanthan, and possibly 2 are new. If you look at figure C, that's one of the species that's thought to be new, and D is another species. So 2 species on Gunung Kanthan, but more work is needed to find out what their relationships really are. So snails are very important on limestone for giving us an indication of diversity. And their study throughout the Kinta Valley showed that Gunung Kanthan is one of the 4 most diverse hills in Perak. So it really is part of our national heritage, our national nature heritage. Next one, please. And it's the same for plants. We've shown that Gunung Kanthan is actually the hill that has the greatest conservation importance in Perak. It has more than 200 species squeezed on that very small area. 30% of them are endemic to Peninsular Malaysia. 6 are critically endangered. That means endangered by extinction. And 7 are endangered. And zone C, which is a very high cliff with a very exposed summit, has much higher diversity than zone D. And you can see C in the picture, this little pretty herb. This was a new species that we discovered when we were doing our survey. Next slide, please. So here you can see area C with area D in the background where the cave is. And you'll see there that the limestone forest is indicated. This is a very deep valley. It has a river running, or a small stream running through it. And this is the only place where there's a reasonably thick layer of soil. So you get quite large trees. And of course, it's very diverse for the amphibians and other wildlife like birds that you get in the valley. But what I want to indicate here is that when you look at conservation, you have to take a holistic view. Because one thing we discover when we say look at plants or look at the animals is that they're not uniformly distributed from one end to the other. They tend to have very specific different niches. And so you will get different species on area C than you get on area D and vice versa. So when we look at conservation, we need to look at a holistic attitude and take the whole of area C, D, and the limestone forest. And if you think of that goat, the sorrel, how can it possibly survive on just one little segment? It needs the area to roam around to get enough food, and the limestone forest is a very important place for the sorrel to survive in the long term. And next slide. We mentioned the cultural importance and how the caves are seen to be holy. And there are two caves for Buddhism or Taoism, and also two Hindu temples. This particular Hindu temple on the right, on festival days, attracts more than 1,000 worshippers. So it's not a small shrine, it's a really well-known local temple with a lot of followers. And most critical to the conservation of the hill is the monastery, where the monks actually are in residence. So it's not only their place of worship, it's also their home. Next, please. So I've been mentioning the importance of conservation, but this is nothing new. In 1991, the Malaysian Nature Society carried out a year-long multidisciplinary survey of the Kinta Valley. And they identified Gunung Kanthan as one of the 4 most important karsts in Perak. And that was 30 years ago. Later on, the local Ipoh local draft plan also indicated that Gunung Kanthan is one of the hills identified for education, research, and conservation. So it's well known that Kanthan comes out very near the top of the list. And our recent studies show that snails is one of the 4 most important. For plants, it's the most important. And it's not the end of studies. Since 2014, when several surveys were carried out, more and more new plants, animals, including snails, and other creatures have been described on Gunung Kanthan. So one of the things we feel is that it's not a good idea to destroy something before you really know what there is there and it's been properly documented. And in fact, in 2018, the Kinta Valley Geopark was declared, but unfortunately it only includes Zone D, which is not part of the holistic entity that should include Zone C and the Limestone Valley. The Geopark is to open up tourism packages, which will make them better known to the public. But conservation of biodiversity and the preservation of geological features should also be a very important aspect of geoparks. Next. But we do have to balance conservation with mining, because everybody knows if you come to Malaysia, you will see multi-story tower blocks sprouting up everywhere. The demand for cement is exponential, and it comes from limestone. And for Perak State, They need mining as a source of revenue for the state. It provides employment, and their limestone provides about 200 different products, chemical products and rocky products that are important for development besides cement. But there is another alternative to mining the karst hills, these erect tower karst freestanding hills. Ramley and Mio from the Mineral and Geology Department showed that under the ex-tin mining land, which is now a wasteland, there are 6.3 times more subsurface limestone than there is above ground. So this is actually, they say, almost an unlimited source. There are already 3 quarries in Perak that are apparently using subsurface mining. So the previous miners of Gunung Kanthan, Lafarge, Malaysia, commissioned a study by Petronas University of Technology to look at the feasibility of using subsurface mining on Gunung Kanthan. And the results of this survey was announced at the 29th International Congress of Conservation Biology in Kuala Lumpur, in which they showed that the subsurface mining of Gunung Kanthan is feasible, so that there is not an imperative to mine the karst above ground. However, we were a bit shocked to discover in 2020 that the Associated Pan Malaysia Cement Company had been awarded a mining license for Zone C of Gunung Kanthan. So what next? Next slide, please. There are still many unknowns. This new plant species here was only published in the last 3 or 4 months. New animal species like the snails continued to be discovered. The cave drawings I told you was reported in the paper just 2 or 3 weeks ago. The fossil survey is not complete yet, so there'll be new findings there. The cave ecosystem, the animals that live in the guano, has hardly been studied at all. We don't know how that system works. And the surround population, how many are there? Is the area big enough? What will happen if mining goes on? So it's very much a case of having a feeling that we will burn the library before the books have been read if we continue to mine the karst hills when there's the potential to mine the subsurface limestone. Next one. Next, please. So is there any hope for Gunung Kanthan? One thing that you see again and again is that people think that they can rehabilitate after mining. But the problem with karst hills is that you can't recreate a cave and recreate a stalagmite that has taken not thousands of years, but millennia to grow. And how are you going to preserve all 200 species of plants and the 60 species of snails when we don't know exactly what requirements they need for nutrition and reproduction? And so the best way for conservation is always to preserve everything in situ where it's living, because extinction is forever. We cannot recreate the very fascinating, biodiverse, natural heritage that we have on our limestone hills. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kiew, for your talk and for revealing so many pertinent facts about the situation in the Kinta Valley, in particular Gunung Kanthan, and the multiple values. Thank you for sharing that with us today. Your presentation has really helped us underscore the significance of Gunung Kanthan, not just as an important karst formation, but also as the last limestone forest left in Perak, and a sacred place that is home to a plethora of endemic flora and fauna which coexist within it. Not to mention the discovery of important archaeological fossils, the teeth of the now extinct orangutan. All of this forms an intrinsic part of our heritage and could be lost if Gunung Kanthan is not preserved. From the limestone hills in the Kinta Valley, Perak, Malaysia, we now take you to our second speaker, who will share her own personal experience with having campaigned to salvage limestone hills in the Yorkshire Dales in the north of England. Our second speaker is none other than the illustrious Dame Fiona Reynolds, whose accolades on this page say it all. Dame Fiona Reynolds was born in England and graduated from the University of Cambridge with a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1979. And further to that, she attained a Master of Philosophy degree in Land Economy from the University of Cambridge. Throughout her life, she has tirelessly campaigned with much success to preserve and conserve heritage in the United Kingdom, and in so doing has also broken many a glass ceiling. In her 30s, she was the first woman chief executive of the Council for the Protection of Rural England. Later, when she took office as the Director General of the National Heritage Trust from 2000 to 2012, she broke tradition by being the first woman to lead the previously male-led trust. And in assuming her position as Master of Emmanuel College, Cambridge in 2012, she reversed 430 years of tradition to become the first female master of the college. She has been described as a warm, enthusiastic figure who famously brought open arms conservation to the once frosty National Trust. Reynolds is a doer who leads by example. Dame Fiona Reynolds her efforts have not gone unnoticed, and she was appointed Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the 2008 New Year's Honours for services to heritage and conservation. In 2019, she was awarded the Royal Geographical Society's Patrons Medal for her contribution to environmental protection, conservation, and the preservation of the British landscape. She is currently the chairman of the International National Trust Organization, INTO, and we are indeed greatly honored to have her here with us tonight. Thank you, Dame Fiona, for being so enthusiastic, passionate, and supportive of the Gunung Kanthan issue and for agreeing to be with us this evening. We look forward to learning about how you have successfully campaigned to conserve and preserve heritage and environmental sites in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. A very, very warm welcome to Dame Fiona Reynolds.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just very conscious there. You see, my hair has changed colour since that picture, hasn't it? I've got a bit older. So yes, I'm what we say in English. I don't know if you've heard this phrase. I'm the jam in the sandwich, because you've heard an extraordinary presentation from Dr. Ruth Kiew. Thank you so much. And you can see the plaudits pouring into the chat at the moment. A really brilliant talk and passionate, and left us with a sense of how important your campaign is. And you're about to hear from Katherine Malone-France, another brilliant talk from the other side of the Atlantic from here about a campaigning charity that's doing extraordinary work in a similar field. So I'm, as I say, the jam in the sandwich, and I'm going to start really by trying to link the two to explain how a global movement has arisen from the passion of individuals and organizations trying to save places that they love and are of huge significance. And I really felt for you, Ruth, because back in the 1980s, and this is 40 years ago, so it was a long time ago, when I was in my very early 20s, I ended up leading a fight to protect a bit of limestone country in England. And here it is. This is the Yorkshire Dales National Park. And this is what's called Kilnsea Crag, a very, very famous landmark that is really important for nature conservation. Climbers love it in many ways, very similar to the limestone outcrops that you were talking about. Now, what you can't see in this picture, you have to climb up to see. And I don't have a picture of it because this is 40 years ago and we don't have pictures that are digitized, I'm afraid. But just tucked over the horizon there is an enormous quarry, Coolscar Quarry, which had been there for many, many decades before the national park was designated, but was being quarried increasingly intensely. And it applied for planning permission, aggregates industries, and the word aggregates to extend the quarry in the very early 1980s for roadstone, to build roads. We had a massive road building program going on in the UK in the 1980s, and they wanted lots of limestone to build these roads. And astonishingly, the National Park Authority was minded to accept their application. So it would have gone through and the quarrying would have bitten an even deeper hole. And actually seeing your picture of those limestone faces, that's exactly what its cool scar was like. These deep limestone faces caused by the way that limestone is quarried in vertical shafts. Now, my tiny charity, the Council for National Parks, objected, and thankfully so did the Countryside Commission, which was the government's statutory advisor on landscape. And we forced a public inquiry, and it was my very first experience having to stand in a public inquiry before highly trained and frankly, you know, hotshot, aggressive lawyers to explain why this beautiful place should not be quarried, to the point where the quarry would have been visible, would have been a great scar in the landscape. And I was arguing not just on the science and on nature conservation and on all the issues that you were talking about, Ruth, but I was also campaigning about the importance of beauty in our landscapes and the cultural and the philosophical and the spiritual value of beauty. And we were sneered at, frankly, by the opposition, but we believed in what we were doing, and we gathered a great momentum of local opposition, because we were particularly shocked that the quarry owners wanted to extract aggregate, because this limestone, and I wonder if it's the case in Malaysia too, is high quality limestone, something like 98% pure. And it should be used, in our view, for the chemical industries, for specialist end users, not to build roads. And part of our case was in fact on that whole point. Don't mine a national park for building roads, which themselves are environmentally damaging. So there was a long fight, a big public inquiry, and a long wait for a decision. I went back through the record, and my president, Lord Hunt, you know, the person who led the Everest expedition in the 50s, asking questions in the House of Lords repeatedly, no answer, no answer. And then finally, and thrillingly, the decision said, yes, quarrying can continue in this site, but the limestone must only be used for specialist end purposes. Now, that was not what the quarry company wanted at all. And in fact, it signed the death knell of the quarry, because it wasn't economic simply for those specialist end users. And eventually, and it took until 1998, aggregates industries announced that the quarry would close, there would be no further applications for extension, and it's now being restored for nature. And it did so alongside planning permissions for other quarries in other national parks, particularly the Peak District, which is also a limestone landscape, and indeed withdrew and said it would not apply for planning permission in a national park again. So there is hope that quarry companies, you know, if put into that position, may change their minds and may decide not to go ahead. So this story of campaigning against damage to the future of like these beautiful areas is what's been going on all over the world for the last century and more. Pressure for commercial extraction overriding natural, cultural, and spiritual values. And that was the founding mission of the National Trust for England, Wales and Northern Ireland. The need to protect special places forever for everyone, founded in 1895. And over the last 125 years, organisations like the National Trust have sprung up all over the world to do the same thing, to protect special places, to stop short-term exploitation, and to enable people to enjoy and to derive personal value from visiting these places and knowing they exist. The International National Trust family today has over 85 members in 65 countries, which is absolutely extraordinary. They vary enormously. Some are tiny, some are big, some are campaigners, some are property owners, but they all share that core purpose of believing that what we're doing is something of immense importance to humanity, making sure we look after these irreplaceable places and ensure that our heritage and our nature thrive in the long-term future. And you're going to hear more about that from Katherine, Malone-France, from one of our bigger members, the US National Trust for Historic Preservation. So we have a shared passion for heritage and nature. We want to learn from each other, share experience, share expertise, and help each other. And for me personally, remembering that young campaigner 40 years ago, I'm just incredibly proud to be its chair. And nothing, frankly, could be more important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dame Fiona, for sharing your campaign with us. I mean, and the crusades against the powers that be at the time. I mean, I can just imagine your passion and your conviction to sort of pushing it through. You're so right in saying that heritage is irreplaceable, and they do form our national, cultural, and spiritual values. We hope that we'll continue to be able to learn from one another in the INTO family, and to take a note of your book to move forward in doing the work that we do as guardians of heritage and culture in our country. An equally passionate and vibrant campaigner, we are pleased to introduce our third speaker this evening, who will share with us the importance of preserving our national landscapes through her own experience in campaigning to preserve the very sacred Bears Ears Monument site in Utah. Our third speaker hails from the United States, where she's currently living and working out of Washington, D.C. Katherine Malone-France is a graduate of Wolford College with a Bachelor of Arts in History and holds a Master's in Historic Preservation from the College of Environment and Design at the University of Georgia. She's currently the Chief Preservation Officer of the National Trust for Historic Preservation and is an INTO trustee. Prior to assuming this role, Katherine served as a Senior Vice President for Historic Sites at the National Trust, leading its portfolio of 28 historic sites around the United States to provide expansive and sustainable public benefit as they model exemplary preservation, collections management, and interpretation. I thought I'd just mention that a couple of these sites include iconic works by American architects such as Frank Lloyd Wright's Pope Leahy House in Alexandria, Virginia, and Philip Johnson's Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut. Katherine's tenure also included the creation of a dedicated fund to support historic gardens and landscapes at the National Trust Historic Sites, and the successful completion of a multi-million-dollar campaign to address critical capital projects across the portfolio of sites. Her leadership has resulted in a diverse range of collaborations with contemporary artists, creating new works inspired by National Trust sites, and a revision of the National Trust collections management policy that has been hailed as a national model for its inclusion of historic structures and landscapes. It is such a pleasure to have you join us here this evening, Katherine. And I know you've had a very early start to accommodate all our time differences, so thank you so much. We are very appreciative of this and for your time to put this presentation together amidst your very, very busy schedule. Please extend a very warm welcome to Katherine Malone-France. Over to you.
Thank you, and good morning. It's lovely to be with you all this morning. And I think if we could just move on to the next slide. Wonderful. It has been fascinating to learn more about Gunung Kanthan and to hear and be a panelist with Dr. Kiew and, of course, Dame Fiona. Dame Fiona, it was wonderful to hear part of your origin story that I had not heard. But I think both the previous panelists spoke about this sort of title of my presentation, which is this tremendous imperative of preserving cultural landscapes. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I feel like that's imperative, but those really echo, I think, what both Dr. Kiew and Dame Fiona have said. One thing I'll note before I begin is that the National Trust for Historic Preservation in the United States sounds like we're the government, but we're not. We're a privately funded nonprofit organization. And as you'll see, sometimes we're advocating for our own government to change its policies. So some people sometimes assume by our name that we are a part of the government, but we are an independent nonprofit organization. So next slide. I am personally deeply passionate about cultural landscapes. As you heard in the introduction, my my background comes, my academic background comes from landscape architecture, from the College of Environment and Design at the University of Georgia. So I'm rooted in this. In fact, I tend to think of the landscape before the buildings, which is not the case, I think, with all preservationists. But, you know, here are just some general thoughts about why it is so important to advocate for cultural landscapes. And you know, I include cultural landscapes that are large and small and middle-sized in this. And, you know, each of these ideas, I think, springs from one larger truth, which is that cultural landscapes are dynamic and evolving places. And in them, you see how closely our cultural and our natural resources are intertwined. You see how they represent and are tied to so many different forms of our health, our cultural health, our spiritual health, our environmental health, our social health. And they hold such tremendous meaning for people in different ways, and the potential for engagement, whether it's beauty, as Dame Fiona just spoke about, recreation. There are so many different forms of engagement with our landscapes, large landscapes, that provide such tremendous public benefit. And that they do really, while they are reflective of our layered pasts, they also offer places where we can together steward our natural and our cultural resources. I love this little graphic here. It's not ours at the National Trust. Let me be clear, it belongs to one of our board members, Christina Lee Brown, her Circle of Health and Harmony. She uses it to guide her, her work. And I just think it illustrates this interconnection of all the different kinds of health that are present in our cultural landscape so beautifully. So what I'd like to do now is just highlight a couple of examples of campaigns of ours related to large cultural landscapes. I think you'll see some successes and some challenges in these. You'll also see, as both the speakers have alluded to, the long-term engagement that is required in advocating and preserving cultural landscapes. So next slide. The first place I'll highlight is this. Bear's Ears, which is a landscape in southeast Utah that is a little under 2 million acres, and it tells the stories of diverse people over about 12,000 years. Next slide. This absolutely stunning landscape is unusually intact. It contains significant natural resources, geological features, and many archeological sites that tell the stories of migration, settlement, and adaptation. And I want to echo something that both Dame Fiona and Dr. Kiew said, which was when a cultural landscape like this is gone, it is gone forever. When you have this level of intact resources, when it is lost forever, which is why it is so important for us to advocate on its behalf. This land also contains places that are sacred to 6 different nations that are indigenous to North America, as well as evidence of the settlement and westward expansion of the United States. Again, all layered and intertwined with one another. Next slide. So our work on Bear's Ears has really been in 2 phases, and again begins back in 2007. So our engagement here, as with so many large cultural landscapes, is for the long term. Our first focus here was supporting a national monument designation, which is a high level of protection given by the federal government. This was in part to protect this landscape from oil and gas extraction, but also to acknowledge the tremendous significance of this landscape and the multifaceted significance of it. For the National Monument designation, we worked with a broad coalition of partners, to make the case for this designation. And indeed, in December of 2016, President Obama designated the Bears Ears National Monument designation. But then, and I'll talk about this in a moment, you know, there was a change in administration. And so we had to shift gears because the previous administration, the Trump administration, revoked this hard-fought national monument designation and replaced it with 2 smaller monuments, which removed the protections on about 1 million acres of this land. So we found ourselves in a position then of defending not only the Bears Ears Monument, but also the larger legislation, the Antiquities Act, that, that enabled that designation. Next slide. So just a few thoughts on the campaign itself, which included research projects, public meetings, congressional hearings, hearings with our federal legislature, site visits with elected officials and many others. And we also placed the Bears Ears on what we call our 11 most endangered list, an annual listing of 11 places in the United States that are threatened, immediately threatened. And I'll speak more about that in just a second. But as you can see here, this was a multi-pronged campaign designed to draw attention, but also to better understand what was at risk, and then to advocate with decision makers for its protection. Next slide. Some of the keys to success here, of course, was building an incredibly broad coalition and collaborating across it, coordinating all of our tactics, our funding, our research, our outreach, and in doing so, really building relationships that have stretched beyond the Bears Ears efforts in and of themselves. You know, we had all of these different tracks, many of which mirror what Dr. Kiew was talking about. And the truth was that none of these tracks on its own, research or advocacy with elected officials or drawing public attention, none of these tracks on its own would have protected Bears Ears, but together in aggregate, they led to the initial national monument designation. As I said, we had to switch gears and then shift to a defensive posture. And, you know, I think one of the challenges of a long campaign like this is that you've got to continue to keep people engaged, to generate fresh content, if you will, and to also keep up sort of a drumbeat of opportunities to engage. We find ourselves now in a situation in which President Biden has issued an executive order, and he did this very, very early in his administration, that called for a review of the boundaries that had been set by the Trump administration for the Bears Ears National Monument. We're also delighted on the appointed officials front to have had Secretary of the Interior Holland visit Bears Ears following her confirmation. And so we await the Biden administration's decision on whether or not to restore the original boundaries of the Bears Ears Monument. And we are very hopeful that they will do so. But we understand too that we will need to be engaged along with this broad coalition in protecting this landscape for the long term. Next slide. I want to just briefly touch on one other major advocacy tool that often we use to apply to large cultural landscapes, and that's our 11 most endangered historic places list. For more than 30 years, every year we've issued this list. And so in that time, we have identified 300 properties actively threatened, with local groups working to support and to preserve them, and also with preservation solutions that can meet those threats. And it's been incredibly successful. Over 300 properties have been listed over 30 years, and less than 5% of them have been lost. I want to just touch on very quickly a couple of landscapes that we've listed in the past. Next slide. I think they illustrate the range of cultural landscapes, but so many of them have commonalities. From Antietam National Battlefield, known as the bloodiest day, the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history, and our own Civil War, threatened by shopping center and other developments. The listing led to increased public attention and public funding. Today, it is seen as one of the nation's best preserved Civil War battlefields. On the right, you see 9 Mile Canyon in Utah, thousands of ancient petroglyphs and pictographs, rock shelters, granaries, and other cultural resources dating back over 1,700 years. And again, a space deeply sacred to nations indigenous to North America. Threatened again by energy development, recreation, overuse, but also by truck traffic through a dirt road in the middle of the area that was treated with a dust suppressant. That dust suppressant was damaging the petroglyphs. So one of the early wins here after listing on our 11 most endangered list was simply paving the road so that that dust suppressant was not damaging the petroglyphs. And then again, continuing to work for, as Dr. Kiew said, that sustainable balance between tourism, energy development, and cultural resource protection at 9 Mile Canyon. And then my last slide, just 2 other more recent examples. Rossawek, which is located in Columbia, Virginia, at the fork of the Rivanna and the James Rivers, a place deeply sacred to the Monacan Indian Nation and threatened by a water pumping facility, which was to be built right at the heart of this confluence of the rivers. Again, deeply sacred ground, but also layered with cultural resources. After our 11 most listing, the Water Authority has agreed to study an alternative site, and the archaeological study for that site is now underway in consultation with the Monacan Nation and other preservation partners. And last, the Boston Harbor Islands listed this year, where more than 12,000 years of resources, cultural resources, as well as ecological resources, are threatened by a changing climate, particularly sea level rise and increased coastal erosion. We have high hopes here for mitigation strategies, especially the City of Boston's new archaeological climate action plan. But we also need to raise public attention, generate funding for mitigation efforts, and continue research, as Dr. Kiew said, to understand what could potentially be lost here. So I'll finish there. I hope we have time for a few questions if we run over, but thank you so much. It was an honor to be with you.
Thank you so much, Katherine, for opening up to us about the campaign and for the pointers that you shared with us. I think these are invaluable because it is always challenging to try to find ways to convince the authorities of the significance and importance of the preservation of historical sites and landscapes and national monuments. So I think this is something that we all face and we're constantly striving to try to overcome. I think what you mentioned about keeping people engaged continuously and to keep new content coming is so important to keep the fire alive, so to speak. So I think maybe this is one of the ways that we are reaching out to approach the preservation of our national heritage through these webinars and through inviting speakers such as yourself to join us. So thank you very much. This evening of exchange that has looked at Gunung Kanthan as a case study has proven most enlightening for all of us, I would say. And hopefully we will be able to learn and share more strategies going forward on how best to preserve and conserve historic sites that are being threatened. Because for the magnitude of the loss of heritage sites is such that once gone, as you correctly said, it can never be retrieved or regained. And it is through sharing sessions such as these that we hope to learn and understand better how best to resolve and navigate sometimes choppy waters And I do hope that in the upcoming Q&A session, we will be able to discuss possible solutions and actions that can contribute towards the preservation of Gunung Kanthan, and beyond that, the limestone hills that form the iconic landscape of the Kinta Valley. So can we have all our panelists on board? Yes, we're all on board now. Fantastic. So there's one question that's come in for Dr. Ruth. In your talk, you mentioned that one solution, or one of the solutions to quarrying, was subsurface mining. Would you be able to expand a little bit further on that? For example, is subsurface mining safe? And is it a feasible way to mine for limestone without damaging the limestone mountains?
The thing is, the whole of the Kinta Valley is a large limestone plate. In places, I'm told it's about 200 meters thick. But the thing is, it's not a solid plate. It's riddled with passages where streams flowing. So I think, I mean, I'm not a geologist, but one of the problems with subsurface mining is the hydrology. That you must make sure that you don't upset the hydrology of the surrounding area. But I mean, the University of Petronas, this is the sort of thing that they were looking at. And if they say that it's feasible, then I think that it is feasible.
Okay, no, thank you for that, Dr. Ruth. We have another question in relation, again, for Dr. Kiew, from Ying Ping So, who's asking if there are any plans for the Malaysian authorities to open recognized karsts to the public. Karst hills, limestone hills, I'm assuming.
Well, I mean, several of the geoparks in Perak are, in fact, limestone caves, because caving is becoming more popular. But this can be a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, we want people to go and see all these things that are really precious. On the other hand, it has to be done in a very controlled way. You can't have too many people in a cave, because just their breathing will raise the carbon dioxide, and then you'll get algal growth that it can cover any of your rock paintings. And then, you know, too many people going and they take a little bit of a stalagmite here and a stalactite there. The whole place can be ruined in no time at all. So it's not an easy thing to open up a show cave where people can go and see things, learn a lot, and appreciate it without causing permanent damage to the cave. So it has been done in Malaysia, Batu Caves, in the dark caves, but you can't just get anybody to be a tour guide.
Of course.
Not only safety, but this thing that the damage is permanent. Stalagmites don't grow back.
Indeed, indeed. And again, I think, sorry, so a lot of the questions seem to be coming in about everybody's very concerned about what's happening in Malaysia. Sugumaran Madikam has asked if you think conservation studies in Malaysia are lacking in support, and does scientific research funding in this field usually get the necessary attention and support? I suppose that's in relation to the studies that you do in your field work and so on and so forth. Have these been commissioned? Is there funding, enough funding?
There is, in Malaysia, there is a national conservation fund. And in fact, this is funded FRIM, Forest Research Institute Malaysia, to do a survey of Kelantan and Perlis. And also, just in the last few weeks, a complete catalogue of all the limestone hills in Malaysia, with drone pictures, and has just come out, funded by this one. I would say more of the problem is that feet on the ground. Do we have enough scientists who have the expertise to go and visit these places? And it's quite true, I would say, for 80 to 90% of these karst hills, we have very little information at all on plants, animals, geology. So it's still a tremendous treasure trove of things to be found out.
Indeed, indeed. I think, yeah, you're
Does that
right.
answer?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I believe so. Now, this is a question posed to Dame Fiona and Katherine, from Katherine Leonard. And she, would like to ask whether you have any suggestions on action that Malaysians could take, perhaps letter writing, or whether there could be a public inquiry. Do you have any further ideas of how you think Malaysians might be able to take this forward, this campaign forward?
Let me begin, and Katherine can follow, partly because Katherine has already given some really good suggestions, and I think her practical suggestions will be essential. I saw on the chat people asking whether public inquiries exist in Malaysia to the same extent, and whether the end-use control lever that we pulled all those years ago is available. And I don't really know the answer to that, but, and maybe Ruth can help us. But you don't need to be allowed to do something to campaign about it, is what I would say. Mm-hmm. The process of campaign creates new processes and new ways of intervening. So actually the sheer evidence of big public concern about something creates, the government starts to think we need to handle this, and so there may not be a sort of neat public inquiry process. I honestly don't know, but just the very fact of people calling for one, sometimes make things happen that have never happened before. And the same with end-use control. End-use control was not a thing before Kulskar. Our victory on that occasion established it as a new public policy. So you don't have to work, this is a very radical thing to say, but it's true, you don't have to work with existing processes. If you can show that there's sufficient public concern, you can make new processes happen and make new debates happen, and people start to have a recognition that existing processes are not adequate. So I just say have faith. Katherine is a much more current campaigner than I am, and I'm going to turn to her now, but all I would say was be bold. This is a moment of truth for these landscapes. I was absolutely moved beyond words by what Ruth said. We do not want to see these landscapes go. You need to leave no stone unturned, but create new things, new opportunities for public dialogue about them.
That's beautifully said, Fiona, and I couldn't agree more, especially with the sentiment to be bold and to create tools and campaigns that are tailored to the resource, because each of these resources has its own particular significance and power. And I would say, though, this idea critical to all of our campaigns, I think in any situation, but particularly in large landscapes, is working to build a broad coalition that includes all of the different groups for whom these landscapes are important, and bringing them together around this shared interest, but also bringing them together to bring their own expertise and perspectives to this, and their own strengths, not to sort of end up with some kind of homogenous group, but to really celebrate the strengths and perspectives of each of the different groups fighting to protect these landscapes. I think, and Dr. Kiew talked about this beautifully, doing the research, whether it's on biodiversity or ethnographic studies. I mean, the research is critical to understand what is at risk. But in the same breath, I say that it's doing the research, but it is also effectively sharing that research, using that research and breaking it down to be able to provide powerful anecdotes and examples that will attract the attention of the media, that will compel elected officials. I do think, too, this idea of the intangible and the tangible heritage that is represented in these places, that combined with the ecological resources is such a powerful argument. And I think this argument around health, I mean, we are in the midst of a public health crisis. I mean, we are considering our health in ways, and our interconnected health in ways that perhaps we have not in the past. And I think, again, the little graphic I showed from our board member, really speaks to the interconnectedness of our health that I think you see in these cultural landscapes. And last of all, I think articulating your campaign in the context of looking for balance and looking for solutions. That it is not simply to stop something, but it is to create, as Dame Fiona said, something new, some new way forward for the particular resource or landscape. And then I think most of all of this work is so rooted in perseverance. You've already seen this. I saw in the chat a number of administrations already as you've been engaged in this campaign, and certainly more to come. So knowing that you're in it for the long term is, I think, critically important from the very beginning, and making that kind of commitment, because again, once these are gone, they are gone forever. And we are lesser for that.
No, I couldn't have said it better. Thank you so much for that. I think, it's really, this whole evening, I think, really has brought to the foreground that how important it is that for us to persevere and for everybody to sort of come together, because it really isn't for us today, but it is for the next generation and the generation after that, what's left. So I think we've got time for one more question, and this question is really is for both Katherine and it's for Katherine actually, and it is: were there any, or are there any indigenous people living? Sorry, question for both Dr. Kiew and Katherine. Are there any indigenous people living in the Gunung Kanthan area or the vicinity who can be mobilized? And were Native American communities in the Bears Ears and 9 Mile Canyon sites engaged to preserve these areas?
I'll just answer the second question quickly, which is to say yes, deeply. Those indigenous nations who have connections to both of those resources were at the very center of the coalitions working to preserve them.
Okay, that's I mean, I think
and that is a critically important component.
Absolutely.
Would not have succeeded, but also wouldn't have done it without, again, those indigenous nations at the very center of those efforts.
And Dr. Kiew, in terms of Kanthan, are there any indigenous groups in that area?
Indigenous, you mean orang asli, do you?
I would imagine so, yes.
No.
No, right? Okay.
Nowhere in the vicinity at all.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So, okay, well, I think we've really sort of come to the end of our webinar, but no, I don't think we have any more time for anything else. But no, thank you all so much for being with us, this evening, all our speakers. It's a big thank you to each of you for making the time to prepare for and to be present this evening. I think all of us at Badan Warisan Malaysia and INTO are deeply grateful for your time. Very, very big thank you to the Secretary General of INTO, Katherine Leonard, who has been instrumental in putting this all together and a consistent source of encouragement and enthusiasm from the minute we started planning for this webinar. Without you, this tonight could not have materialized in the way that it has. And we at Badan Warisan Malaysia truly feel that we're so much a part of an extended family, being a part of the INTO network, and we are truly grateful. Thank you so much. Also, a very big thank you to the team at Badan Warisan Malaysia, our General Manager Vanessa Leung, and Amira and Ruzbiza for putting this all together this evening. And last but not least, a big thank you to each and every one of you for joining us this evening, for being a part of this evening's discussion, and for attending the webinar. In order to carry out the work that we do at Badan Warisan, we depend on public funds, as we do not receive any funding from the government. And we do hope that you will all be able to donate to our cause. Also, if you're not a member, we do hope that you will join us as a member to help create a bigger heritage community in Malaysia, and to help us to continue the work that we do and to spread the word. All information is available on our Badan Warisan Malaysia website. So till our next webinar, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye now. Thank you.
Bye.